In June 1954, a housekeeper walked into a quiet home in Wilmslow, England, and found the country's greatest codebreaker dead on his bed. Beside him lay a half-eaten apple. The man who had helped defeat Nazi Germany, whose work is credited with saving millions of lives, had died alone, disgraced, and nearly forgotten. His name was Alan Turing. For decades afterward, the British government would not even admit what he had done during the war. The man who helped win it was erased from the story of the victory itself. To understand why, we have to go back to a boy who felt like he belonged nowhere. Alan Turing was born in London in 1912, the son of a colonial civil servant. His parents spent long periods abroad, and Alan was raised largely by relatives and boarding schools. He was awkward, easily bored by rules, and fascinated by numbers in a way his teachers found strange rather than impressive. Reports from his schoolmasters described a boy who ignored subjects that bored him and disappeared for hours into mathematics no one else in the room could follow. At Sherborne School, he found something rarer than approval, a friend named Christopher Morcom, who shared his love of science and mathematics. The two boys traded ideas about astronomy and physics, and for the first time, Turing had someone who didn't treat his mind as a problem to be managed. Surviving letters and later accounts suggest this friendship shaped Turing deeply. When Christopher died suddenly of illness in 1930, Turing was devastated. Some biographers believe this loss pushed him toward a lifelong question that would define his career: could the mind, could thought itself, exist beyond the fragile body that carried it? That question would eventually lead him to a machine. If a subject like this, a brilliant mind shaped by loss long before the world noticed him, is the kind of history that pulls you in, stay close, because what happens next is even harder to look away from. By the mid-1930s, Turing was studying at Cambridge, and in 1936 he published a paper that quietly reshaped the future. In it, he described a theoretical device now called the Turing machine, a simple concept that could, in principle, perform any calculation a human could. It sounds abstract, almost dry. It was, in fact, the intellectual seed of every computer that exists today. But in 1936, almost no one understood what he had done. He was simply a brilliant, unusual young mathematician with an idea few people could follow. Then the world went to war, and his strange gift suddenly mattered more than anyone expected. In 1939, Britain was in danger of losing the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats were sinking supply ships faster than Britain could replace them, and starvation was a real possibility. The Germans communicated using a machine called Enigma, which scrambled messages into code so complex that German commanders believed them unbreakable. Turing was recruited to Bletchley Park, a secret estate northwest of London where Britain's brightest mathematicians, linguists, and chess players worked around the clock trying to break that code. The estate itself looked almost peaceful from the outside, a Victorian mansion surrounded by lawns and lakes, with wooden huts built quickly across the grounds to house the growing teams of codebreakers. Inside those huts, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Staff worked in shifts through the night, surrounded by the constant clatter of machinery, cups of cold tea going untouched, and the pressure of knowing that every hour of delay could mean another ship sunk in the Atlantic. Turing, according to colleagues who later wrote about him, was an odd presence even there, brilliant but socially distant, sometimes cycling to work wearing a gas mask to control his hay fever, chaining his tea mug to a radiator so no one else would use it. His eccentricities became part of the Bletchley Park legend, but they sat alongside a mind that colleagues consistently described as the sharpest in the building. Here is where the story becomes something the public wouldn't hear for 30 years. Turing didn't just help break Enigma. He designed the bomb, an electromechanical machine that could test thousands of possible code settings faster than any human team. Working with colleagues like Gordon Welshman, he refined it into a weapon that could read Germany's naval communications almost as fast as the Germans sent them. When Turing and his team finally cracked the naval Enigma code in 1941, British ships could be warned away from U-boat positions before an attack happened. Convoys that would have been destroyed made it home. Historians estimate that the work done at Bletchley Park, with Turing at its center, shortened the war by roughly 2 years and saved an estimated 14 million lives. If you want to understand how much one mind can change the course of history, sit with that number for a moment. But here is the strange part of the story: almost none of it could be spoken aloud. Everyone at Bletchley Park signed the Official Secrets Act. Turing went home each night to a country that had no idea what he had just done to protect it. He couldn't tell his mother. He couldn't tell a friend at a dinner party. The greatest achievement of his life had to be carried in complete silence, and that silence would outlast the war itself by decades. After Germany surrendered, most of the machines at Bletchley Park were destroyed on Winston Churchill's direct order, and the staff scattered back into ordinary life, forbidden from ever discussing what they had built. Turing moved forward, as he always did, toward the next unanswered question. He went to work on early computer design at the National Physical Laboratory, then at the University of Manchester, helping build some of the first working electronic computers on Earth. In 1950, he published a paper proposing what became known as the Turing test, a way of asking whether a machine could think convincingly enough to be mistaken for a human. It's a question we're still arguing about today, in laboratories that didn't exist when he first wrote it down. By any reasonable measure, Alan Turing should have spent the rest of his life as one of Britain's most celebrated scientists. Instead, in January 1952, his life quietly began to fall apart. That month, Turing's home in Manchester was burglarized. When he reported it to the police, the investigation turned, unexpectedly, toward him. In the course of questioning, Turing admitted to a relationship with a man named Arnold Murray. Under British law at the time, sexual relationships between men were a criminal offense, regardless of consent or privacy. Turing was arrested and charged with what the law called gross indecency. He did not deny it. He didn't seem to believe he had done anything wrong, and in some ways, that honesty made his situation more dangerous, not less. Friends later said Turing answered the detectives' questions almost matter-of-factly, as if the law itself were the strange, illogical thing in the room, not his own life. It was the same directness that had once helped him question a code no one else could break. In front of a British court in 1952, it worked against him completely. At his trial in March 1952, Turing was convicted. The court gave him a choice between prison and a treatment involving hormone injections designed to reduce his sex drive, a process now widely understood as chemical castration. Wanting to continue his research and avoid imprisonment, Turing chose the treatment. Historical accounts describe the physical effects as significant, including changes to his body that deeply distressed him. His security clearance was revoked. The government that had depended on his mind during its darkest hour now treated him as a threat to be monitored and contained. Notice how quickly the story reverses. A man once trusted with the nation's most guarded secrets was, within a decade, no longer trusted with secrets at all, not because he had betrayed anyone, but because of who he loved. Friends who knew him during this period describe someone trying, in his own quiet way, to keep working, keep thinking, keep moving forward. He continued research into mathematical biology, studying how patterns form in nature, an interest as far from wartime code breaking as one could imagine. But the isolation was real. The conviction had cut him off from the clearances his work once required, and from a society that, at the time, offered little sympathy to men like him. If you're finding Turing's story as remarkable as we do, it's worth taking a moment to think about how much of the history we know depends on records that survived by chance, letters kept, files unsealed decades later, memories finally spoken aloud. That's often the difference between a life remembered accurately and one left to rumor. On June 8, 1954, Turing was found dead in his home. The inquest concluded he had died of cyanide poisoning, and the coroner ruled it a suicide. The half-eaten apple beside him has become one of the most debated details in the story, partly because Turing was known to enjoy eating an apple before bed, and no test was ever conducted to confirm cyanide was in the fruit itself rather than ingested another way. Some historians accept the suicide finding without hesitation, pointing to Turing's documented distress and the pressures closing in around him. Others have raised the possibility of accidental poisoning from chemicals he used in home experiments. The exact truth remains unknown, and it likely always will. What is not in dispute is the outcome: a mind capable of imagining machines that could think was gone at 41. For years afterward, his death was treated the way his greatest work had been treated, quietly, and without explanation. The wartime achievements that might have offered context for who he was, and what he had already given his country, remained classified. The public knew nothing of Bletchley Park, nothing of the bomb, nothing of the 14 million lives connected to his work. They knew only that a mathematician had been convicted of a crime and had died. The man was reduced to a headline, stripped of everything that made his story make sense. That silence lasted until the 1970s, when details about Bletchley Park finally began to be declassified. Slowly, historians and journalists pieced together what Turing and his colleagues had actually done during the war. The public began to understand, for the first time, that the same government which had prosecuted him had also owed him an extraordinary debt. It took even longer for that understanding to become an apology. In 2009, after a public campaign, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a formal statement acknowledging the injustice done to Turing, calling his treatment appalling. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted him a posthumous royal pardon, meaning it was given after his death, an honor he could never know about, a rare and symbolic act that could not undo what had happened but could, finally, say clearly that it had been wrong. For years later, Britain passed a law informally known as the Turing Law, extending pardons to thousands of other men convicted under the same statutes. Before we reach the end of this story, it's worth pausing on how long that gap really was. Turing died in 1954. The formal apology didn't come until 2009. The pardon followed in 2013. 59 years passed between his death and a government finally willing to say, without qualification, that what had been done to him was wrong. None of it reached Turing himself. That's the part of this story that resists easy comfort. The recognition, the pardon, the national pride in his achievements, all of it arrived decades after he was gone, offered to a version of him that existed only in memory and paper. In 2021, his image was placed on Britain's £50 note, alongside a quote from his own writing and a diagram from his foundational paper on computation. Today, students studying computer science anywhere in the world learn his name as a foundation of their field, not a footnote to a scandal. So return, for a moment, to that quiet house in Wilmslow in June 1954. A man who had shortened a war, who had helped imagine the machines now sitting in almost every pocket on Earth, died largely unknown to the country he had saved twice, once from an enemy army, and once from the possibility that it might have lost the war of ideas that came after it. History didn't erase Alan Turing by accident. For a long time, it was erased on purpose, sealed by secrecy and by prejudice that took decades to unwind. What remains is not a simple story of triumph or tragedy, but something more honest, a reminder that the people who change the world are not always protected by the world they change, and that the truth, even when buried, has a way of eventually finding its way back into the light. If this kind of history stays with you the way it stays with us, there's always another story like it waiting to be understood a little more clearly.